Good afternoon. The speaker is Caitlin Cook, and she is going to talk about perfectionism and psychopathology. And she doesn't have any disclosure, right? You don't have any financial interest in this. Let me tell you a little bit about Caitlin. She came to us from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and she's gonna go back there soon, and she will be finishing her PhD from University of Nevada. And she did her master's, Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And she had received several awards during her education: Barrack Graduate Fellowship, Graduate Research Training Assistantship Award, and a summer scholarship. And I was looking through her CV. I was impressed that she has already co-authored, and one of the articles, she is the main author, 3 articles and 2 book chapters. So that's quite an accomplishment for her. And on more personal, experience with her, we started this child psychiatry internship like 5 years ago, and we had a really excellent intern during this time, and she continues the same. She's very enthusiastic, hardworking, comprehensive, and she's right now in my clinic. I mean, she's very helpful. So thank you, Caitlin. All right, so you want to come?
Well, thank you for having me talk today. It's nice to see you all, and thanks also for such a nice introduction. As you can tell from the title of the talk, I'm going to be discussing perfectionism and psychopathology, and more specifically, I'll be looking at relationships between parent and child perfectionism and psychopathology. So to introduce the subject and kind of get us started, I just want you to take a look at some statements and consider whether you as an individual can relate to any of them. So this is a personal question component here. And given the typical audience for Grand Rounds presentations, I'd be surprised if many people in this room can honestly deny identifying with at least 1 or 2 of these statements up here. So they are: when I work on something, I can't relax until it's just right. I must always be successful. If I ask someone to do something, I expect them to do it flawlessly. I strive to be the very best at everything I attempt. There's nothing better than feeling as though I've done something perfectly. The better I do, the better I'm expected to do. Others have exceedingly high standards for my performance, and the people who matter to me should never let me down, and I set very high standards for myself. So raise your hand if at least one of these statements applies to you. Okay, an honest crowd that we have in here. Perhaps this talk then will have some personal relevance as well as hopefully some professional relevance for those of you who did raise your hands. The statements represent thoughts, opinions, and beliefs that are typical of individuals who might be identified as perfectionists. Doesn't mean that just because you raised your hand you're one of those, but typical of the group anyhow. Okay, so before I really get started, I'm just going to give you a preview of the areas that I plan to cover today. Specifically, I'm going to start by defining perfectionism from a clinical research perspective, and then I'll also talk for a few minutes about perfectionism in children specifically. I'd also like to describe and summarize some research on that demonstrates some consistent maladaptive correlates of perfectionism, as well as some possible factors that may contribute to the development of perfectionism in youth. And then finally, I will sum up with describing some specific research that kind of puts some of this information together in an effort to really better understand parent and child factors that are involved in perfectionism. So what exactly is perfectionism? Colloquially, we often think of perfectionists as those individuals who have to do things just so. the nitpickers of society, perhaps, or maybe in some cases individuals who sort of seem to rise to the cream of the top and always perform at a higher level than those around them. Definitions of perfectionism in the research literature, though, are fairly consistent with our common perceptions of perfectionism. But there are a number of researchers who have gone to some significant effort to understand and define perfectionism in greater detail. So I'm just going to describe some characteristics that are generally accepted by the clinical research crowd as comprising perfectionism. And those include having high standards for one's own performance, and oftentimes the standards of a perfectionist are virtually impossible to achieve. And the standards may be related to a variety of different areas, such as work, academics, athletics, things going on at home, and so on. Also having a strong work ethic and a strong desire to achieve. Feeling concerned about making mistakes. And in some cases, there may even be a sense of doom associated with the thought of making mistakes. Another important characteristic that's often ascribed to perfectionists is basing a sense of self-worth, sense of self-esteem on ability to achieve and also meet lofty standards. Concerns about criticism from others and also expectations that others have for oneself are also really common characteristics of perfectionists. And it's fairly typical for perfectionists to place a particularly high value on the importance of others, on the opinions of others, rather. Some other characteristics that are common of perfectionists include doubting one's own abilities, also emphasizing order and neatness and the importance of those things, and then also a desire to appear perfect to others or to hide any potential flaws or failures that may be there. So it's worth noting here that there is a pretty distinct emphasis on aspects of perfectionism that are portrayed in a less than desirable light, and that is kind of what we tend to do in clinical research a little bit. But it is important to draw a distinction between having these attributes in a healthy and adaptive sort of way versus a more extreme and maladaptive set of applications of these characteristics. Certainly we can all probably agree that having high standards and a drive to succeed can be a really valuable thing. Certainly those types of characteristics can be largely associated with success in a wide variety of areas. And some clinical researchers have suggested that adaptive perfectionists are those people who are driven to pursue achievement and success primarily because of the rewards that may come from their efforts. So essentially, they're being motivated by positive reinforcing factors like getting praise from others in their lives, personal pride, potentially financial benefits, those sorts of things. And an important distinction between a more adaptive kind of perfectionist versus a maladaptive type of perfectionist would be that adaptive perfectionists can derive a sense of accomplishment and achievement from their efforts. In contrast, maladaptive perfectionists may be motivated to a greater extent by fear of failure, so they may avoid potentially negative consequences of not performing at a certain level, and they may focus primarily on how to avoid doing things wrong, and also miss opportunities to recognize their successes and also celebrate those. So we could speculate that we have someone here who seems to have a good sense of her goal. She's been enjoying the process of working towards it, and now she's experiencing the joy of her accomplishment. Either that, or we do have someone who is really healthily avoiding the potential pitfalls of perfectionism. Either way, she looks like a pretty happy girl to me. So I'd like to also introduce some terminology that was created by a certain set of researchers, Hewitt and Flett, in effort to sort of better understand the complex nature of perfectionism. And I'm going to introduce this terminology now because it'll help provide a well-rounded understanding of what perfectionism is, but also because I'll be referring to these terms later when I describe a specific research study. So it'll get you a little prepared for my description of that and hopefully make it less jargony at the time. Let's see, Hewitt and Flett identified 3 different forms of perfectionism: self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented perfectionism. And with self-oriented perfectionism, this involves placing pretty high demands, very exacting demands on oneself, as well as being particularly self-critical. So this is the kind of perfectionism that we're most commonly thinking about. the source and the subject of perfectionism are the same in this case. So I'm placing these demands on myself. With socially prescribed perfectionism, this involves believing that others expect one to be perfect, so feeling as though others are putting those pressure on oneself. So the perfectionistic demands are perceived as being external rather than being internal. And then with other-oriented perfectionists, they tend to have exceedingly high expectations for others. Certainly it is the case that some perfectionists may fall into more than one of these categories. And it's also worth noting that when I'm describing research today, I'm going to emphasize most heavily self-oriented perfectionism. And the reason for that is it's the type of perfectionism that's most closely aligned with the broad literature base out there. So there are a number of studies that have used different types of measures, for example, and have looked at perfectionism not necessarily using these three categories. So I've talked at some length about perfectionism in general, and perhaps in a way that applies a little bit more directly to adults than it does to children. I'm going to take a moment or two to introduce child perfectionism specifically by just reading a short case example. Caroline is a 9-year-old girl in the 3rd grade. She is bright, typically does very well in school, and has been well liked by all of her teachers. For Caroline, doing well in school and making her parents proud is extremely important. Caroline spends 2 to 3 times as long as her classmates on her homework assignments because she checks her answers several times. When Caroline is writing or drawing, she often erases and starts over repeatedly until she gets something just right. She tends to avoid doing art projects because her art is just never good enough. And Caroline recently earned a B on a math quiz and cried for hours afterwards. She now feels worried that she will never be any good at math. So Caroline's self-expectations are pretty harsh, aren't they? They include high performance in school. She really expects herself to get straight A's all the time, and she was really distressed when she got a B on a quiz. The time that she spends on schoolwork is extensive, and she may stay up extra late working on assignments. Parents and teachers typically reinforce these kinds of behaviors, and it's easy to see why. She's working hard, she does her homework, she wants to get A's, she's not giving her parents too much trouble with any of these things. But then the same parents and teachers may become frustrated when a child like Caroline struggles to move on from one task. She gets stuck on doing it because she needs to do it so perfectly, or she takes an excessively long amount of time to complete a task that seems like it should be relatively simple. So child perfectionism behaviors oftentimes involve checking and rechecking work, starting over repeatedly, withholding assignments because they haven't been done just perfectly, requiring extra parent involvement, having difficulty working with other students who don't have the same standards and same self-expectations, and so on. And child perfectionists also often perceive their parents as having the same kinds of lofty expectations of them. They may also be particularly concerned about disappointing their parents. Caroline and others like her often avoid doing things that they feel incapable of being the best at. So in her case, she avoided doing art because she didn't feel like she was good enough at that subject. Other examples of areas where children who are perfectionists might avoid being involved at all would include things like athletics or drama. And that's certainly not to say that perfectionism can't be applied in those different areas. For example, there's a pretty wide literature base to demonstrate a consistent relationship between perfectionism and being a competitive athlete. So there are a number of studies on that specifically. When children like Caroline find that they can't meet their own standards or the standards that they feel like others are holding them to, they often experience this as failure, and they feel like that's particularly devastating. So when does perfectionism become problematic? We've addressed some of these points, but just to kind of summarize a little bit, perfectionism is problematic when an individual's standards for performance are unrealistic and rigid, and this often leads to a frequent experience of failing. When an individual emphasizes their own mistakes and imperfections above other things. When they measure their worth in terms of their accomplishment. So I'm a good person, or I'm worthwhile if I can meet these standards, but if not, then I'm in the pits of despair and nothing's good about me. When there's a strong need for others' acceptance. Also, when a person is unable to derive a sense of achievement from their efforts, so they're working incredibly hard and trying to meet these standards, but they never feel as though they've actually achieved anything. There's always the next set of things to do perfectly. Also, when perfectionism becomes, when it leads to procrastination, which is often the case, and then when an individual experiences a discrepancy between their expectations for their own performance and their evaluations of their own performance. So we have here an example of a budding perfectionist. Hey, hun, I finally finished writing the first line of my book. It took me 3 months, but it's the best first line ever. Kind of typical of some perfectionists who get stuck in what they're doing. So the research on perfectionism among adults is a lot more extensive than the research on perfectionism in children. There is, however, substantial evidence to suggest that perfectionism is related to multiple forms of psychopathology among children and adults. The slide right here with the table just summarizes some of the research findings that are out there that connect perfectionism and psychopathology. So among adults, there's fairly consistent research to show a connection between perfectionism and depression, hopelessness, social anxiety, panic disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, eating disorders, and then also type A personality, which has its own host of health-related problems. Again, the child literature is a little bit more sparse than the adult literature in this field, but there are a number of studies that show that child and adolescents who are perfectionists also show symptoms of depression, suicidality, anxiety, anorexia, bulimia, low self-esteem, and also hypochondriasis. So this strong connection between perfectionism and psychopathology provides a pretty compelling reason to continue to improve our understanding of perfectionism in general, as well as its development, and then also its potential impact on treatment of mental health concerns. So one question that's important to ask is how perfectionism might actually develop in an individual. And again, the research is really not well defined here just yet, but there are a number of different theories as to how this might happen, so I'm going to review some of those. With social learning or modeling, this would occur when in this particular situation, parents would contribute significantly to the development of perfectionism in their children. From that perspective, children are most likely to develop perfectionism by observing their perfectionist parents who do things like emphasizing the importance of doing things just so or in a very particular way. And their parents may also model other behaviors like avoiding or escaping situations where making mistakes are likely. Consistent with that particular model, several studies of adult children, using undergraduate samples in other words, and then their parents have suggested that the children of perfectionists are more likely to self-identify as perfectionists. So there's some research to back that up. As another possibility, perfectionism may be more likely to develop among children who learn that they have to meet certain achievement or behavioral expectations of their parents in order to earn their parents' love and approval. So the existing research does suggest that parents of perfectionists are often more controlling, less affectionate, and somewhat harsher than the parents of non-perfectionists. In some cases, perfectionism may also be more likely to develop in reaction to being in an unstable environment. So in a sense, an individual may learn that behaving perfectly is the best possible way to avoid punishment, abuse, and/or other undesirable forms of attention. In other words, perfectionism may, in some cases, develop as sort of a protective mechanism for children who are raised in overly chaotic environments or environments where physical or psychological abuse is occurring. And then in terms of anxious parenting, similar to the social learning context of perfectionism development, being raised with parents who are especially anxious and who emphasize the dire consequences of making mistakes and also the importance of making a positive impression on others, those types of characteristics, that may also contribute to the development of perfectionist tendencies. The potential contributions of genetics, child temperament, and influences from other areas such as school and teachers are also really important to consider. As you can tell from the list that I just described, though, there's a pretty strong expectation among researchers that parents play a particularly large role in perfectionism development. And several of the modes of development that I just described do suggest the possibility that parent psychopathology may also contribute to perfectionism in children. So I'm going to spend some time describing and discussing a study that specifically examined the relationships between parents and children with respect to perfectionism and psychopathology. And the purpose of the study was to develop an understanding of connections among parent perfectionism, parent psychopathology, youth perfectionism, and youth psychopathology. The primary questions that the study sought to answer were, does parent perfectionism predict youth perfectionism? Does parent perfectionism predict youth psychopathology? And then also, does parent psychopathology impact any of these relationships? The study included a sample of 97 children aged 11 to 17 years, and then also their parents. In total, there were 53 female and 44 male youth participants of the study, and then 89 mothers and 63 fathers also participated. So in a number of families, we had single-parent families, or in a handful of families, there were fathers who refused to participate or were out of the country and couldn't do so, which kind of accounts for the discrepancy between moms and dads that were willing to participate. The sample was predominantly European American, but also Hispanic, Asian American, multiracial, African American, or identified most strongly with a different ethnic group. And some of the families did include step-parents and adoptive parents, but in all cases, in all cases, the parent participants had lived with the child participants for 50% or greater of the child's lifespan. So we didn't have any parents participating that had just shown up a few months ago or had only been in the child's life for a year or two. The measures that we used in the study that applied to children were the child-adolescent perfectionism scale and then the youth self-report. The child-adolescent perfectionism scale is a 22-item self-report measure of self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism. And examples of some items found on the caps include, I want to be the best at everything I do, and there are people in my life who expect me to be perfect. For the purposes of this study, an emphasis was placed on self-oriented perfectionism in youth because this helped to maintain comparability with other research out there that didn't necessarily use the same measure. We did examine some of the data with socially prescribed perfectionism, though. And then the youth self-report is the 112-item self-report measure of internalizing, externalizing, and mixed symptoms. I know a number of you will be particularly familiar with that one. And this particular instrument was used to gather information about symptoms of psychopathology among children. And our study emphasized the anxious depressed, withdrawn depressed, and total internalizing behavior scales. The reason for this being that most of the research shows that perfectionism is most closely related to more of the internalizing disorders as opposed to behavior problems and externalizing disorders. The parent measures that we used in the study were the multidimensional perfectionism scale and then the symptom checklist 90 revised. So the multidimensional perfectionism scale is a 45-item self-report measure of self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented perfectionism in adults. And some examples of items found on that scale would include, one of my goals is to be perfect in everything I do, and my family expects me to be perfect. And for this study, we did emphasize self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism, again, to be consistent and maintain comparability with the other research out there. The symptom checklist 90 is a 90-item self-report measure of 9 different symptom groups. And for the current study, we used it as a measure of adult psychopathology symptoms, and we emphasized the scales that looked at anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive symptoms. So families were recruited to participate in the study from community centers, after-school groups, churches, and private schools. And participation in the study typically involved between 30 and 45 minutes of a time commitment. The study was explained, and then informed consent and assent were obtained from the parents and children respectively, and then they were asked to complete the measures after they had been given instructions. And there was a member of a research team available to ask any questions throughout their participation. The data analyses, without getting into too much detail and putting you all to sleep, included correlation analyses of the basic relationships among parent and child variables, And then also hierarchical multiple regression analysis was used to test some prediction models in which the independent variables were parent perfectionism and parent psychopathology factors, and then the dependent variables were child perfectionism and child psychopathology factors. We also conducted mediational analyses following the Barron and Kenny approach when we did find significant models via hierarchical multiple regression analyses. Specifically, we used mediational analyses to examine the impact of parent psychopathology factors on the predictive relationships between parent perfectionism and youth perfectionism, and then also between parent perfectionism and youth psychopathology. So just to give you some background general results, the data were examined to determine whether there were any significant differences between males and females with respect to the various types of perfectionism that were measured, as well as with respect to the different symptoms of internalizing psychopathology. And there were no gender differences among youth or adult participants, meaning that males and females of all ages in this study anyway showed similar levels of perfectionism and also similar levels of the various symptoms that we were examining. We also looked to see if there were any significant differences among ethnic groups and did not find any, although it would have been difficult with a fairly homogeneous group to find any significant differences there. So as I mentioned, we conducted correlation analyses to examine the basic relationships among the measured variables. And interestingly enough, the data were largely non-significant for fathers participating in the study and also for daughters participating in the study. In other words, we didn't find correlations between perfectionism and psychopathology for either of those groups, for either fathers or daughters. For mothers, however, self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism were each positively and significantly correlated with anxious, depressive, and obsessive-compulsive symptoms. And then for sons, self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism were each significantly and positively correlated with anxious, depressed, withdrawn, depressed, and also internalizing symptoms overall. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of the questions that we were interested in answering was whether parent perfectionism predicted perfectionism in children. Existing theory on the possible pathways of development for perfectionism suggested that this would be the case, and so we used the regression analyses to examine several models in which parent variables of self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism were set up as predictors of self-oriented perfectionism in youth. And because we had done the preliminary correlation analyses that showed some differences between males and females with respect to the perfectionism psychopathology variables, we did conduct all of these analyses separately by gender. And with those particular analyses, a significant model was found in which maternal self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism predicted self-oriented perfectionism in sons. Specifically, a higher maternal self-oriented perfectionism was associated with higher self-oriented perfectionism in sons. So mothers who placed particularly high expectations on themselves were also more likely to have sons who placed perfectionistic demands on themselves. Higher maternal socially prescribed perfectionism, on the other hand, was associated with lower self-oriented perfectionism in sons. So mothers that felt like others expected perfectionism from them were actually less likely to have sons who emphasized the importance of achievement without making mistakes and those kinds of characteristics. We also examined the relationship between parent psychopathology and child perfectionism. And based on the ideas about perfectionism development that I described earlier, we speculated that children might actually be more likely to develop perfectionist tendencies if they were raised with one or more parents who showed some symptoms of depression, anxiety, and/or obsessive-compulsive disorder. And we did find that maternal anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive symptoms significantly predicted perfectionism in sons. Mother's symptoms did not predict perfectionism in daughters, and then father's symptoms did not significantly predict child perfectionism in either sons or daughters. So as I mentioned, a significant model was revealed in which sons' self-oriented perfectionism was predicted by mom's symptoms. And within this model, higher levels of maternal depression, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive symptoms were associated with higher perfectionism in sons. And then maternal depression was the strongest predictor in the model. We were also interested in learning whether parent psychopathology would mediate the relationship between parent perfectionism and child perfectionism. And because we found significant models in which maternal perfectionism predicted sons' perfectionism, and then also maternal psychopathology predicted sons' perfectionism, we were able to test and see whether any of those maternal psychopathology variables did mediate that relationship between maternal perfectionism and sons' perfectionism. So just a little bit of stat stuff. In order for mediation criteria to be met according to a pretty standard approach developed by Barron and Kenny, it was necessary to first establish a significant relationship between the initial variable, which in this case was a maternal perfectionism variable, and then the outcome variable, which in this case was the child perfectionism variable, son's perfectionism specifically. Then the initial variable has to also be significantly related to the mediating variable. So in this case, that was going to be a maternal psychopathology variable. And then you have to show that the mediator affects the outcome variable when the initial variable has been controlled for. So mediation is established if a relationship between the initial variable and the outcome variable is no longer significant or it shrinks after the impact of the mediating variable has been accounted for. I know, that's a lot of jargon. But in our case, basically what that means is that a significant model was found where maternal obsessive compulsive symptoms mediated the relationship between maternal self-oriented perfectionism and son's self-oriented perfectionism. In other words, there was sort of a catalyzing influence of maternal obsessive compulsive symptoms on this parent-child perfectionism relationship. Similar mediational analyses were also conducted for the other parent perfectionism variable for socially prescribed perfectionism, but the results were non-significant. So we were also interested in learning whether parent perfectionism would predict psychopathology in children. And to this end, we again conducted hierarchical multiple regression analyses, and we examined models where parents' self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism predicted the anxious depressed, withdrawn depressed, and total internalizing symptoms in children. And again, we found a significant model that involved mothers and sons, specifically maternal self-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism, significantly predicted sons' internalizing symptoms. So they predicted that general overall category of internalizing symptoms in sons. And finally, we did test models in which parent anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive symptoms predicted child anxious depressed, withdrawn depressed, and internalizing symptoms. And we did again find a significant model where mother's symptoms predicted internalizing symptoms in sons. Because we did have significant models in which maternal perfectionism and then also maternal psychopathology symptoms separately predicted internalizing symptoms in sons, we performed mediational analyses, and we were testing to see if any of those maternal psychopathology factors would mediate the relationship between maternal perfectionism and psychopathology in children. But the results of those analyses were not significant. So as you can tell, a significant number of the findings in this study primarily related to mothers and sons alone. Specifically, maternal perfectionism predicted self-oriented perfectionism in sons. And it's kind of interesting to find that mothers who reported particularly high self-oriented perfectionism also had sons who reported putting a lot of pressure on themselves or having the same kind of perfectionism. But then mothers who reported feeling as though others expected perfection from them, they were less likely to have sons who reported self-oriented perfectionist tendencies. So those findings may suggest that sons are more prone to being perfectionists if they have moms who model perfectionism and emphasize the importance of meeting a certain set of high standards. On the other hand, mothers who feel burdened by the expectations of others may do a particularly good job of protecting their children from experiencing this similar type of burden. Another striking finding from this study was that obsessive compulsive symptoms in mothers did mediate that relationship between self-oriented perfectionism in mothers and sons. And perfectionism has been linked to obsessive compulsive disorder in a number of studies, even among preschoolers. Some researchers would contend that perfectionism is almost like a subtype of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and others have also suggested that perfectionist individuals and individuals with obsessive-compulsive disorder share some cognitive patterns, such as concern over making mistakes and an inflated sense of personal responsibility. So it'll be interesting to see if the catalyzing influence of obsessive-compulsive symptoms in moms on that relationship between maternal and son's perfectionism is replicated in other studies, since that's the first time that anybody's found that. The other primary findings in the study involved the prediction of internalizing symptoms by maternal perfectionism and also maternal psychopathology variables. And again, those relationships were only existent for mothers and sons. So the results of the study overall are partially consistent with our expectation that parent perfectionism and psychopathology would be associated with child perfectionism. But it does seem that, at least for the children that were assessed in this sample, the relationships only existed between mothers and children. And it's difficult to try and explain why that would be, but one suggested reason is that mothers typically, and I'm basing this on research, not just on stereotype, I promise, mothers typically spend a greater quantity of time with their children during their early years especially, as compared to the fathers. So as a result, to the extent that the influence of parent variables on child perfectionism and psychopathology is related to socialization processes, for example, as opposed to a purely biological relationship, then it might make sense that maternal characteristics would have a greater impact on child perfectionism and psychopathology. The fact that the relationships between the parent and child factors were only significant for mothers and sons and not for mothers and daughters is even more difficult to explain, probably. One possibility is that the factors contributing to perfectionism and development in girls versus boys are simply different. So perhaps daughters are, for example, less impacted by their parents in terms of development of perfectionism. Another alternative might be that parents simply treat their daughters differently. Perhaps they have lower performance expectations for their daughters than they do for their sons, or perhaps their expectations for their daughters tend to be more in other areas of achievement, like social achievement. And again, that's based somewhat on some research literature that indicates that that could be the case. So the results of the study that I just described for you, as well as other research on perfectionism in children, certainly do suggest that understanding how perfectionism develops could be a valuable endeavor. Perfectionism can be associated with a wide range of adaptive characteristics as well. So understanding how it develops and comes to exist in a child, especially how it develops into an adaptive form of perfectionism versus more of a maladaptive form of perfectionism, could be particularly helpful. I also described that perfectionism is related to a wide range of clinical symptoms, and this continues to be the case with the current study. So gaining a better understanding of perfectionism, especially at its early stages, has some important implications for treatment of those related disorders. And then there is a body of research that suggests that perfectionist tendencies may have a negative impact on treatment outcome among individuals. So that's a particularly good reason to keep perfectionism in mind when you're working with children who do show some of these internalizing disorders that are often associated with it. Parent factors are also do seem to impact child perfectionism development, so this suggests the importance of keeping those parent variables of perfectionism and psychopathology in mind when you're working with child perfectionists. And then again, it's important to mention that there are a range of other potential influences on the development of perfectionism, such as genetics, temperament, modeling of teachers and peers in addition to parents, when a child is reinforced and what a child's reinforced for across different environments, and also a child's level of ability in areas that involve perfectionism. So as with any study, there are a number of limitations to the study that I described for you today. First, it's not possible to make causal inferences based on the data that we were using. So it would be particularly helpful to have more studies of perfectionism and psychopathology that involved behavior observations, for example, and also longitudinal research. And a second limitation is definitely sample size. A larger sample size might have led to greater mediational effects because there were a number of different pathways that neared significance but didn't quite reach it in this study. And then also a limited number of measures were used in this study, and the measures all did involve self-report. So there is a lack of confirmatory information regarding the different variables that I was describing today. And it would certainly also be useful to have some measures of children's perceptions of their parents' perfectionism and psychopathology, and then also parents' perceptions of their children in terms of psychopathology and perfectionism. It would also be really interesting to know whether any of the perfectionism-related thoughts or cognitions that are held by individuals could help differentiate the perfectionists who are having more of a positive experience versus those perfectionists who we would describe as being more maladaptive or having a number of psychological struggles to deal with. So several aspects of the material that I covered today do have particularly strong clinical implications for working with children who demonstrate perfectionist tendencies. One obvious point, again, is that there's a consistent relationship that's been shown to exist between perfectionism and psychological problems, and that relationship really does appear to exist for both children and adults. And this particular study that I described today shows that there may be a particularly strong mental health impact for young males versus females, and that would certainly be worth further exploration and consideration in treatment too. Children in treatment for psychological problems who have perfectionist tendencies are also likely to benefit from a therapeutic approach that incorporates a family work, so that any parent-child relational problems that are going on that may be impacting treatment can become evident and also become a focus of the treatment. And then when assessing a child who does seem to have some perfectionism or perfectionist tendencies going on and you're seeing them in clinical work, that type of assessment should include looking at the functions of the perfectionist behavior. So what purpose is it serving, if any? What are the specific perfectionism-related thoughts? And then also what areas of the child's life are impacted by perfectionism. It's also important to note that based on previous research, child perfectionism, again, may negatively impact treatment outcome. So treatment with child perfectionists may necessitate a slower or longer-term approach, and also an emphasis on building a strong therapeutic alliance. There isn't a lot of research out there on treatment outcome among perfectionists that are children, but there is some research among adults that's really consistently shown that adults who are depressed, for example, and who are also perfectionists have worse treatment outcomes, and a lot of that seems to be related to difficulty developing a strong therapeutic alliance, and then also difficulty with a short-term form of therapy versus a longer-term approach. So finally, I have listed some possible directions for future research. First, as with any study, the findings that I described today certainly bear replicating, particularly in light of the fact that the existing literature is kind of mixed with respect to parent-child relationships regarding perfectionism. So some studies have found greater concordance among same-sex parents and children with respect to their perfectionism. In other words, they found that sons who have dads that are perfectionists are also more likely to be perfectionists themselves, and then the same relationship for mothers and daughters. But all of the research that has had those kinds of same-sex findings has been with adults as opposed to working with children directly. Oops. I'm not quite ready, but I'll keep talking anyway because you saw that slide long enough. Then the longitudinal research that examines perfectionism and psychopathology among children and parents across time would certainly be beneficial and would help us to better understand the development of these characteristics. And also an examination that more specifically looks at the developmental pathways would also certainly be of benefit. So we have another little budding perfectionist, non-perfectionist, I'm not sure, but he looks like he's having a good time doing what he's doing, and it's pretty effective. So I made sure to leave some time for questions if you have any today. Thanks for taking the time to listen to what I had to say. Any questions? Well, you're an easy audience then. Yes. Oh, there are two.